authoritative announcement of a solitary man acknowledging trespass on the hunting territory of another, and she turned her head slightly to cock her ear as her father hooted and rattled his spears in reply. The man shouted louder, identifying himself as a Puntaro, an Ngala of the Arunta. The Arunta was the tribe of her family, but from the way the man formed his words, he was from a long distance away. Meira's father identified himself, his voice fading as he moved toward the man. Their deep voices were a barely audible murmur as they talked. The minutes slowly dragged by. The muscles in her thighs began aching, and her neck became cramped from keeping the wiri balanced on top of her head while in the crouched position. But she remained unmoving, because she had not been released from the command for absolute silence. Life was fraught with danger, a gauntlet of hazards and perils. And from earliest childhood her mother had drummed into her by reprimand and example that safety lay in immediate and unquestioning obedience to her father's commands. There were poisonous snakes and insects, brush fires, flash floods at times of the Duran, the cold winds from the north which brought dark clouds. The slightest sound, when commanded to be silent, could frighten away game her father was stalking, which could mean starvation when food was scarce, or it could announce their presence to enemies in the area. From the time she had been able to walk, her mother's cautions had been reinforced by swift, painful, and unfailing punishment from her father, and obedience was instinctive and unthinking. For her, there was a special danger which had developed during the recent past. Invaders from other tribes occasionally roamed abroad to find and capture young women for wives. So her mother was allowed some latitude. Her brother was permitted more, and she had none. Her father whistled, calling them forward. It was not an imperative command, so her mind returned to the lizard. She crept forward under the fringe of stiff, prickly spinifex blades, sliding the stick through her hand and gripping the end of it, and she poked it into the left side of the base of the clump of spinifex and stirred it. The lizard leaped out, racing toward another clump. She jerked the stick back, balanced it on the tips of her fingers, and threw it like a spear. The heavy stick flashed through the air, and the end of it struck the lizard's head and crushed it into a smear. 2 fat grubs fell out of the spinifex where she had pushed the stick into it, and they squirmed around, trying to crawl back into the grass. She gathered them up and put them in her mouth as she stood up, and she munched them as she stepped forward and picked up her stick and the twitching lizard. Everything eatable was saved for the common meal when food was scarce, but it had been relatively plentiful during the past few days, and it was permissible to eat the grubs. She put the lizard into the bag hanging from her shoulder, knelt by the clump of spinifex again, and raked the end of her stick through the base of it, and dragged out 4 more grubs. She gathered them up and put them in her mouth as she got back to her feet, and walked toward her father through the clumps of spinifex and acacia, automatically taking light, virtually soundless steps, and avoiding blades of grass which might rustle, and pebbles which might click together. The odor of another person carried to her nostrils on the breeze through the grass, blended with the warm, appetizing scent of a fresh kill. It was a large animal, with the tangy, musky smell characteristic of a kangaroo. The smells became stronger, mixed with omnipresent and scarcely noticed odors of her mother, brother, and father. The spinifex and brush thinned out into a small area of clay pan where water had coursed sometime during the past when it had rained heavily, gushing along and sweeping away the growth as it sought lower terrain, and leaving a smooth, hard surface as it subsided and dried up. Her mother and brother were sitting on their heels in the shade of the foliage at the edge of the small opening, and her father and the other man were kneeling together on the other side of it, talking in low voices. A small kangaroo, which had been gutted, folded, and tied with blades of grass to carry on the shoulder, was on the ground by the other man, and the smell of the blood and fresh flesh was almost overpowering, making her salivate. She dropped her